Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm glad that you could join us today. This is an exhibit that we did at the Historical Society. It's up on the walls, and we recently put some of it online. And this just focuses on the 45 soldiers and their Gold Star families from Plainfield and the surrounding area who made the ultimate sacrifice for the country during World War One. Some were born here, others were immigrants, but all served their country with valor. I'll try to make it bigger for you. Let's see. Special thanks goes to Leanne Nicole Manna, who was the curator, and myself. I helped research it, and Stephanie Clarkstein, who was an intern from Rutgers. Also, the New Jersey State Archives, Military and Wartime Records, Ancestry, Fold 3, and newspapers.com. And funding for this exhibit was made possible by the Gannett Foundation. Okay. All right. This is the City Hall honor roll. The names of the men are listed on the left-hand side. And the picture that you're looking at is the memorial at Watchung Avenue, East 7th Street in Plainfield. It's the World War I Flagpole Memorial. The property is owned by the Crescent Avenue Presbyterian Church. And there's an agreement between the church and the city to put this monument there. The city maintains it. In about 1926-25, the city of Plainfield allocated approximately $45,000 for the construction of the Flagpole Monument. City council members and veterans of the Civil War, Spanish-American War, and World War I were part of the War Memorial Committee. However, there was a controversy because there's an inscription from Isaiah chapter 2 on the monument, and the veterans organizations objected to it because they thought that it was too much of a pacifist kind of inscription, but it's still, the inscription is still there. And basically what it was is a nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And that's what they objected to. But it still got on there because other organizations said that that was just it was inspirational, not a fantastical inscription. Harvey Wiley Corbett, who lived from 1873 to 1954, was the designer of this monument. If anybody's ever been to Alexandria, Virginia, he designed the George Washington Masonic National Monument that was begun in 1922. It was dedicated in 1932, and it was finally completed, the interior, in 1970. If you go on the Beltway, you can see it as you go past Alexandria, Virginia. The gentleman who was the sculpture for it, for the base, for the frieze, is Galatano Cesare. He was born in New York. He was an American sculptor from New York City, and he did the bronze band around the flagpole. And this picture, a picture of this flagpole monument, is in the Smithsonian archives. And then if you go see the picture below, this is the 2001 Veterans Memorial that's outside City Hall. Back in around 1999, people realized that there was no monument for the Vietnam veterans. So Mayor Al McWilliams had a committee of citizens who worked on this. I was among many people in town that worked on it. It was a labor of love. It was a lot of work because we had to research all the names. Mrs. Tiffany Corbett, now deceased, had her class, her Plainfield High School history class, write to all the Vietnam veterans members, family members, and she got a lot of information for them. It was very moving when the family members got to meet the students at the unveiling of the monument. Plainfield Granite Works, who is a long-term business in town, actually designed the monument and also installed the monument. We compiled books that contained information for the World War I soldiers, World War II, Korea, Vietnam casualties. There is one woman veteran who died in an air crash during the Korean War in 1959, whose name is on the monument. Her name is Jean Garofalo, who had lived on Netherwood Avenue and was in the Women's Air Force. She was on her way home to visit her parents from Hamilton Air Force Base in California when the plane crashed in Arizona in December 30th, 1950. West Point graduates were also on board. And today, as a matter of fact, just before this started, I found out when I looked on the state website that her name is not included. So I contacted them and let them know that they need to add her to the list in the state website because they don't have it. Just a minute. Okay. This is a slide of Gold Star mothers. What happened was so many young men were buried overseas that people were really upset. So there was a activist group, a lot of groups got together and said, listen, we need to take the mothers overseas to see where their sons are buried. So about 1929, 1930, the Congress finally gave money. And so they made a various number of trips across the ocean for the mothers to visit their sons' graves. And we had one from Plainfield, I believe her name was Mrs. Crane, who was able to go from Plainfield to visit her son's grave. And these are some newspaper articles from the 1930s where the women went across. What they found was, you could look it up on Google. What they found, there's a lot of interesting stories from the Smithsonian and different military organizations. What they found was, and they didn't realize that the women were older. And so it went a lot slower than they thought, and they had to get a lot of different permissions, but it helped. I read one story where one of the women wanted to bring her young child, but they said no, you could only it was only for the mothers, and then then the widows. The first soldier who we have is Paul Apgar. He was with the U.S. Shipping Board. He served from September 12th to September 18th, 1918. He was born in Plainfield and he lived on Clinton Avenue. He died of the Spanish influenza, which was at the height during this time. His mother was the person that was notified of his death. And these are some of the cards that we were able to find on the various websites. We have his registration card and then a card that is just an index card that just gives you basic information. One interesting story I read about him, he was 23 years old when he died. The night of his funeral, his older brother, William, 36, died of pneumonia at Muhlenberg Hospital. He had lived next door to him on Clinton Avenue, and his brother, William, left a wife and 4 children. And when you research this, you find that a lot of different people had family members that also died of the flu. The next person is Patrick Greene. I don't have too much information about him other than he served in the U.S. Army from June 5th, 1917 to 1918. He was born in Plainfield, 1895, and he lived West 2nd Street. He was a gardener, and he also died of pneumonia. His aunt was the person that was notified. This is an index card that we found on the New Jersey Historic State Archives, and his aunt lived at Muhlenberg Place in Plainfield, and that's his registration card. A lot of this information is easier to find now than even what we had because now more and more information is being put online. But it's still not easy because you have different spellings of names and dates of birth because there's human error and people didn't transcribe well or people didn't read the handwritten script very well. Howard J. Brees was in the U.S. Navy. He served on June 5th, 1917 to October 18th, 1918. He was born in Neshannock and he lived on 507 Watchung Avenue, which is near City Hall. And he also died of the flu. He died in Gettysburg at a camp in Gettysburg, and he was 29 years old. And I read a story that his wife was summoned when he was sick. They must have telegrammed her, and she was able to get to him before he died at Gettysburg. And you have to remember that it was like it takes about 3 hours, 4 hours to get to Gettysburg now by car. But back in those days, there were no interstate highways. So I have no idea whether she traveled by train or how she got there. But it would have been difficult for her to get there. And there's an obituary and a notice from the American Red Cross, and also his index card and also his registration card. His obituary says that he was employed by the New York Telephone Department. Walcott Corkins II is one of the youngest ones to die. He served from September 7th to October 23, 1918. He was born in 1899. He was only 19 years old. He lived on Madison Avenue in the Van Wyck Brooks Historic District. His occupation was a student. Why would a student be there? Well, he was in the Student Army Training Corps up in Schenectady, and he always wanted to go into the service, but unfortunately he caught pneumonia and passed away. His father, who was at the time the mayor of the city of Plainfield, and in fact, the Courier News wrote an editorial saying that the community shares its executive's grief. His parents and aunt were able to make it to Schenectady before he passed away. But he is the youngest person from Plainfield to have passed away. Although he didn't actually serve, he was, I guess, what we would call it now, the ROTC. Edward Carty was in the U.S. Army. He served from August 23rd, 1917 to his death in October 4th, 1918. He was born in Plainfield. He lived on Orchard Place. He died from disease. If they weren't, most of these people died from the effects of pneumonia. So they may have not specifically died from pneumonia, but from the pandemic, from the flu, but they died from pneumonia or respiratory illnesses. His brother, John, was summoned to South Carolina where Mr. Carty died, but he didn't make it in time. But he did escort the body back. And one of the clergymen compared this young lieutenant's life to that of the clean-souled General Ulysses S. Grant in the Courier News. Paulus Case was in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. And he was born in Plainfield, 1895, and he lived on East Front Street. And he was a health inspector, but unfortunately he died of pneumonia from an influenza. What is interesting was Hollis Case was the only son, and his funeral was at the family home on East Front Street, but it was private because at the time of his death, the city health department ordered that you couldn't have funerals, much like we've had orders today. And it was mentioned in his obituary that I recently saw that his mother had buried her husband, who died on Christmas 3 days later after he passed away. So a lot of family members were dealing with burying more than one family member. This young man, we don't have a lot of information about him from Plainfield, but he was a Polish officer and he trained in Canada, Lula Tawaski. He served from April 2nd, 1917 to April 21st, 1918. He was born in Poland. He lived on East 3rd Street. He was a military inspector, and he was killed in action on April 21st, 1918. Um, his French commanding officer awarded him the Legion of Honor. And as he was lay dying, his last words were, "This is for Poland." And you can see his military record from Canada. Um, I don't know why he joined from Canada, but you can see he was a very proud soldier. Okay. Daniel Compton, he was in the American Red Cross. He served from October 29th to December 3rd, 1917. He was born in Plainfield. He lived on East 3rd Street, and he was killed in action. His father was the one that was notified, and supposedly he was Plainfield's first hero to have passed away during the war. And you can see they had an article, and they also put more than one memorial in the newspaper for him with a picture. I don't know who Jay Watson is, but obviously he was well thought of because they put his picture in um, with the memorial in the Courier News. Thank you for your patience with, it's not easy to keep flipping back and forth. Carlos Castales was 23, and he died performing a night raid on the German lines. He served from June 1st, 1917 to October 16th, 1918, and he was killed in action, and his father, Jose Castales, was the one that was notified. His father did live in New York, but at the time, um, some of the Castaleses lived in Plainfield. The reason some of the people may not necessarily have been residents of Plainfield is just that Plainfield was the site, it was a city, so we were where they were drafted into. So a lot of times the record shows their home of record was Plainfield, although they could have lived in another town close by. Plus, Plainfield, as someone who's worked at the Postal Service, um, I know that Plainfield does cover North Plainfield, Plainfield, Warren, and Watchung. So some of the people would be considered a Plainfield mailing address. Albert Crane was a first lieutenant. He was in the U.S. Engineer Corps, 1916 to 1918. He was born in Pennsylvania, and he lived in the Crescent Avenue district on Second Place. He was killed in action. His wife, Gladys, was the person that was notified of his death. We have a compensation record for him, and we have some letters of her being notified. Some of these records are kind of interesting to read because you can see that she was notified by the American Red Cross down below of his death. American Red Cross played a big role in notifying people of their family members' death. The next one is Charles Diana. He was in the U.S. Marine Corps. He served June 23rd to October 12th, 1918. He was born in Trenton. He lived in New York. He died from pneumonia in France. But his parents were from Plainfield, and while he lived in Plainfield, he lived on Evergreen Avenue. And you have to remember, some of these men, their family members did have two residences. Some lived in New York and some lived in Plainfield. Some of the houses in Plainfield were considered summer residences, so they were back and forth. And that's why there could be two different addresses. When we did the monument, we didn't want to, we wanted to remember them. We didn't want to forget any of the soldiers. So we made the decision to, if they had any connection to Plainfield, we would put them on the monument. Um, Felix Denzio, we don't have too much information on him. He was born in Italy. He did supposedly live in Westfield, and he died of wounds from the war on October 22nd, 1918. Um, his cousin was the one that was notified. He probably mustered in Plainfield, and that's why there were records of him being from the area, so that we put him on, regardless of him being in Westfield or not, because he mustered in Plainfield. Frank Donnelly served in the U.S. Army, 1917 to 1918. He was born in Plainfield, and he lived on West 4th Street, and he was killed in action, and his mother was the one that was notified. His nickname, I found an article, his nickname was Bus. And when he worked at the Spicer manufacturing plant, which is just over the railroad tracks in South Plainfield. It's now a brownfield site. It's past the South Plainfield Library and the South Plainfield Senior Citizens. It's up over the railroad tracks there. When he worked at the Spicer manufacturing plant, he was known as the doctor because he was always bandaging the people's hands if they got hurt at the job. And he was bandaging the hand of a comrade when flying shrapnel snuffed out his life, according to 2 other Plainfield soldiers who saw it happen when he was overseas. And you can see his registration card and his index card. And you can see that his mother was notified and that she lived on West 4th Street in Plainfield. Camille Du Bois was born in France. He served from 1917 to 1919. He died from pneumonia. His mother was the one that was notified. He lived, if you see on his card, he lived on RD3 in Plainfield, which would have been a rural route, postal route. And so he probably lived up in Warren. In fact, there's a road up there called Du Bois Road. It's a very short street, but it still exists, and it's probably named after him. After he passed away, there was a letter that was published in the Courier News that he sent to his sister. Sorry about that. Willard Roth was in the U.S. Army. He served from April 1918 to October 1918. He was born in New York City, and he lived on Prospect Avenue, and he was killed in action, and his father was the one that was notified. An interesting story about Willard Roth is when we started this project back in 2000, and then we picked it up again in 2018 for the exhibit because it was the centennial for the Civil World War I, excuse me. Ancestry allows you a way that you can contact people, and I tried to contact some relatives with family trees, and I didn't get a lot of responses, but after like 8 months, I finally got a response from a family member of Willard Roth, and we went back and forth about 8 emails, and finally at the very end, the gentleman told me that he finally saw a picture of the man that he was named after, so it was quite moving and touching. I did read some articles that this young man was looking forward to coming home. Obviously, he didn't make it, but it's quite sad. But it was touching that finally a family member had a picture of their relative. James Hunter, I don't have much information about him other than the card that you see. he was in the U.S. Navy. He served from 1917 to 1918. He was born in Scotch Plain, and he was a butcher, and his sister was the person that was notified of his death. He was 29 years old. And he also died from pneumonia, from the ravages of the flu. Clarence Jeter was the first African American, according to a story, to die in the World War I from Plainfield. He was in the U.S. Army. He served from 1917 to 1918. He lived on Webster Place, and he was a tailor. And you could tell by the picture that he really liked clothes. His mother, Elise Jeter, was notified of his death. There's a Johnson Jeter Post that's named after him, and he's buried in Hillside Cemetery, I believe. And he also died of pneumonia. And he died at Fort Dix. And he went to Shiloh Baptist Church. James Johnson, it took quite a while for word to be received of his death. He was in the U.S. Army. He was born in Virginia, and he lived on Webster Place, basically right across the street or down near Clarence Jeter. He was a blacksmith helper, and he also died of the flu. His brother was the one that was notified of his death. And you can see it said it was on his registration card. It says blacksmith helper. He worked at the Federal Shipyard in Kearney. And you see down here in the letter, what happened after the war, somebody in the state of New Jersey, I believe it was either in the archives of the library service or the War Department, requested photographs. So they wrote letters to family members that they could find their addresses and requested a photograph of the people. And some people responded, some people didn't. And you can see in this letter that a letter was sent to his brother, and his brother who signed this letter put a PS, kindly return the photograph, as this is the only one we have of him. So people, there weren't copy machines, so they actually sent the original photographs with the hopes that they would get them back. More than one letter would say that, please return the photograph, because it's the only one they have. And that's why some of these soldiers we don't have pictures of, because they probably don't even exist. Now, I know I have a lot of the Kane family member on, and I appreciate it. Many of you recently read the story in Tap Into Plainfield. Martin Kane, we said he was in the National Guard. Well, he was really in the U.S. Army Guardsman, and he served from 1917, 1918. He was an immigrant from Ireland, and he died of pneumonia at Fort Hancock, October 22nd, 1918, and he's buried in St. Mary's Cemetery. His uncle was the one that was notified of his death. I can tell you that as of yesterday, if you've read the story and tapped into, the family that's on this webinar today was notified from the VA National Cemetery Administration that they are in the process of making a grave marker for Martin. So we had thought he was in the Coast Guard, but in World War I, the U.S. Army also used the word guardsman. So we believe he was at Fort Dix, and one of his family members that's on today found a naturalization card that we're trying to research. We believe he was naturalized at Fort Dix, and we're trying to confirm this. I sent an email down to Fort Dix, and I'm waiting to get an answer back. all of this, when you do history and you try to research, it's all like a history mystery, and you get a little clue here, a little clue there, and you have to follow up, and you have to hope that people will respond to your efforts. Um, Fortunately for us, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman's office responded quickly, and so did the VA. So we hope to have a grave marker for Martin within the next 10 days to 2 weeks. Okay, next one is Arthur. Arthur Gazelle. I apologize if I don't pronounce his name correctly. He was in the U.S. Army. He served from 1917 to 1918. He was born in New York, and he lived on Netherwood Avenue, and he died of wounds that he sustained on October 16th, 1918. He worked at the Standard Aircraft Company. It There were a lot of letters, there were a lot of stories in the Courier News about him. There was one that he was a POW in a German hospital, and it was dated October 18th, 1918, and he supposedly died on October 16th, 1918. And if you read the letter that was in the Courier News, it was very suspicious because it almost sounded like he was a prisoner of war and in Germany and behind enemy lines. And it was almost like the enemy wrote the letter on his behalf. It didn't make any sense. And then his mother received a letter from the US War Department in November saying that he was a POW. And then in February 1919, an article in the Courier News said that his mother received word from a friend of his who was in the Army that he had died on October 16th, 1918. So that's where we got the date of October 16th. So it's very curious about really what happened to him. It would be fascinating to try to delve into it more. But he was a POW and he was behind enemy lines when he died. Let me go back. Sorry. Joseph Kunznetz was in the U.S. Army, served from 1917 to 1918. He was born in Russia. He lived on West Fifth Street in Plainfield. He was a waiter. He really was they had a food truck in town, and he operated the food truck, and he was killed in action. And I read a story about him in the Courier News that before he went to war, he told all his friends that he was not going to come back, that he predicted that he would die in battle, and that's exactly what happened to him. It's not easy moving all this. John Larkin was in the U.S. Army. He served until 1918. He was born in New York. He lived on West 3rd Street. He worked at the Spicer plant also. His family member that was notified was his aunt because he lived with his aunt. And one of his sisters, youngest sister, because I believe his parents died, took in the family. And one of his sisters was only an 8th grader when he died, and she was an 8th grader at St. Mary's Grammar School. And they also said he was one of the first to die, charging the enemy. Because word came late, so sometimes the newspapers didn't get information about their deaths until later. So that's why there's confusion of who died first, who died second. But Carl Lindstrom served in the U.S. Army. He was born in Stockholm, Sweden. He lived on East 7th Street, and he worked in the rubber manufacturing, and he was killed in action. And his stepfather, was the one that was notified of his death. It was the only son, and he died on his birthday. Holmes Marshall, we don't have a picture of. I wish we did. He was in the U.S. Army. He was born in West Virginia. He lived on River Road in Piscataway. Like I said, a lot of them mustered in Plainfield, so that's why they're considered Plainfield. His mother was notified, and his father was notified of his death in France, and he had a street named after him, and he also has the Holmes Marshall Fire Company in Piscataway that's named after him. Leon Martel, he is an interesting soul. We have very little information about him, as you can see. He died in service. The only information we have is the fact that he is on the Flagpole base of St. Mary's, outside of St. Mary's School. His name is there. A lot of these young men that went to St. Mary's, and I'm not sure what nationality Leon is, but a lot of them were Irish immigrants. And so the only people that would really know much about them would be the local parishes. And so if it wasn't for St. Mary's erecting a monument in the 1930s, we wouldn't have any idea about Leon. And I have not been able to discover anything about Leon. I haven't seen obituaries. I can't find anything in Ancestry, but his name is on the monument at St. Mary's. So that's why we put his name in the exhibit. Arthur Mundy was in the U.S. Navy. He was 28 years old. He was born in New York. He was a butcher, and he was killed in action, and his mother was the one notified. They received word that he was killed in action, and his brother was also wounded. And supposedly Arthur Mundy was the 14th person from Plainfield to die on the field. A newspaper article later said that his brother George, who was also wounded, had died of pneumonia. But then the War Department had to correct the record and say that he was just seriously wounded. So this poor family got notified that 2 people died, but one actually died and the other person actually lived. So even the War Department made mistakes, not intentionally, but probably because communication was not very good back in those days. Joseph Murray was in the Navy Signal Service. He served from May of 1918 to September 1918. He lived on West 4th Street. He was an accountant for a railroad signal company, and he died of the Spanish flu at the naval base in Newport. The Knights of Columbus went to Newport, Rhode Island, to bring the body back, and they also went to Newport to help the sister who went to be with him. He was nicknamed Buddy, and the Knights of Columbus went to help the family, and he was from St. Mary's, and there was a mass there for him. Sorry. Okay. Ernest Neil was in the U.S. Navy. He served in 1918. He was born in North Plainfield. He lived on Grove Street, and he also died of pneumonia. And his father was the family member that was notified. As I said before, a lot of these young men mustered in Plainfield, So that's why they're listed. He's probably also listed on the North Plainfield Monument also. James Nielsen served from June to November of 1918. He was born in Oakland, New Jersey, and he was a manager, and he also died of pneumonia. He was, according to one of the newspaper articles I read, he was a chauffeur and for many prominent families. And there were different ways of spelling his name, so we may have to correct this panel. Pollock, Robert Pollock, graduated from Plainfield High School, and he was 21 years old when he died. And he served from 1917 to 1918. He was a student at the University of Pennsylvania, and he died from pneumonia in France, and his mother and father were the ones that were notified of his death. And right before that, or his sister had passed away. So family members were dealing with a lot of tragedy in their lives at the time. So you can see in his obituary that a sister of Corporal Pollock died a few days since of the same disease that proved fatal to the corporal. So even though people were separated and apart, they were still getting influenza in different parts of the country. Russell Poucher was born in Bayonne, and he lived on Belvedere Avenue, and he was a manufacturer's agent in New York, and he died from heart disease at the Central Jersey train station. He was going back and forth. I believe they put him in because he had served in the country, served in the service, and he had been, I believe he was wounded, and so they said that his heart, you could see here, his heart was affected by shell shock and gas while serving with Battery C, the 20th Field Artillery, 1st Division in France. So people in Plainfield decided that he deserved to have his name on the monument. There's also a monument, if you're ever in City Hall, there's a monument that they put up there, and that's where we got some of the names. They list all the names of all the servicemen that served from Plainfield, whether they were casualties or not. And they put a star next to the name if they were a casualty of the war. I can't get into City Hall now to check it because of COVID, but I hope to get back in there and see. Here's another example of a transcription error. Joseph A. Roach, U.S. Army, 1917 to 1918. He lived on East 5th Street. He was an armature winder working in a manufacturing plant. He died of pneumonia, but newspaper accounts spell his name R-O-C-H-E, but his records look like R-A-C-H. So once again, we have, human error, transcription errors. The newspaper said, the story about him said that he was rejected from naval service for a vision problem. He and his buddy both had vision problems, and they both had it corrected. Then when he was down in Louisiana, he got an infection in one of his fingers and it had to be amputated in order to save his arm. At the time, he was offered an honorable discharge, but he said no, and subsequently succumbed to pneumonia. So he must not have been a very well young man, because he kept getting all kinds of diseases. And after he died, his family received quite a few letters from him that were published in the Courier News. Ross, William Ross was in the Marines. He served from April to September 1918. He was born in Plainfield. He lived on South 2nd Street, and he was killed in action. And and he was also at Paris Island. He went to Quantico, and they talked about him. There was a bridge that was designated the Victory Bridge. A lot of us have probably been over it. It was dedicated June 24th, 1926. We put this in as a visual because a lot of people don't realize where the terminology came from. The Victory Bridge, it comes from the soldiers from World War One. Sorry. Rothberg served in the U.S. Army. He served from June 5th to November 1918. He was born in Plainfield. He lived on Madison Avenue, and he was a salesman. His mother was notified. And one of the newspaper articles I read was that he was killed in action in the last battle of the war on November, just before Armistice Day. John Champ was 30 years old when he died. He served in the U.S. Navy. He was a painter. He died from the flu. His mother was the one that was notified. In all the stories or the obituaries I read about Mr. Champ, it did say that he had been married and that his wife had died 2 years earlier. But in none of the obituaries did they name her. They just said that his wife died. That's what would happen back then. The women were known as their husband's name. And so unfortunately, unless I do another ancestry search on him, I don't know his wife's name, but she passed away 2 years before he died. John Sharp was served in the U.S. Army from 1917 to 1918, and he lived on East 2nd Street, and he was a painter. His uncle was the one that was notified. Some of these young men didn't have parents. Their parents either died, and so they lived with other relatives, and so family members were notified. John Sharp, in one of the stories about him, his father, he was the nephew of an assistant postmaster of Plainfield, William Sharp. And so depending on what your job was, depending on what status you had in the community. So they made sure that they said that he was the nephew of the assistant postmaster. Alfred Slauson is the next one. He was a corporal in the U.S. Army, and he served from April to September 1918. And he lived on East 9th Street, and he was a clerk. And he was 30 years old when he died. He was killed in action. And he worked for the Farmers Loan and Trust Company in New York City, according to his registration draft card. I don't want to pass up any of these young men. Courtney Starkweather was in the U.S. Army. He served from 1917 to 1918. He was born in Massachusetts, and he lived at Second Place in Plainfield, part of the Crescent Avenue Historic District. He was a clerk, and he died of pneumonia. 23 of the 45 casualties died of pneumonia or flu-related illnesses. It didn't say what relationship Lewis Starkweather had to Courtney, but you probably can do an ancestry search and find out if it was his father or his brother. Howard Storr was 24 years old when he passed away. He was served from 1917 to 1918. He was born in Plainfield, and he lived on West Front Street, right down the street from the Drake House Museum, and he was killed in action. And his father was the one that was notified of his death. I read a story or an obituary about him that he was a train man for the New Jersey Central Railroad, which is the railroad that would have ran right outside of his house. That is still in existence, the Raritan Valley line. And his sister was a nurse at Muhlenberg Hospital. There was a report in the newspaper that someone had seen him alive, but he did pass away. So there were all kinds of stories going around, misinformation. It must have been heartbreaking for the family to hear that he died. Then maybe somebody saw him alive, and then turns out he passed away. Herbert Terry served from 1917 to 1919. He was born in Fanwood, and he lived on East 2nd Street, and he was a bookkeeper. I'm not sure if he's related. He probably is related to the Terrys that still live in the area today, Terry Luzou, etc., but I'm not sure of the exact relationship. And you can see his registration card. And he worked in New York City as a bookkeeper. A lot of these cards, you can get a lot of information from them, and then they can lead you to another source of information. But it's not always easy to find it. Frederick Vogel was older. He served, we're not sure exactly how long he served. He lived on West 3rd Street. He worked for the Edison Diamond Disc Studio, and he died from disease. And his surviving member was his wife. You could see that he had in the city directory, he had his disc studio. And this is one of the letters that they sent to family members requesting photographs. And they were asking her again a second time for a photograph of Frederick Vogel. And I don't know why William Duffy. I'll have to check back and look into Ancestry and see if there's a connection. But they haven't received the photographs, and they were wondering if they were lost in the mail or if she overlooked sending to them. And they would like to have them because they wanted to make sure that they could have a picture so they could remember these men. One of the interesting things about Frederick, just before the pandemic ended, we had a school trip of kids in the Drake House Museum. A lot of them were bilingual students, and we were having them do some activities, and I saw a young man with his head an inquisitive look on his face, and head was down, he looked a little sad or looked a little whatever. And I said, well, what's wrong? And he pointed to this man's picture up on the wall. He goes, that man's got my name. It turns out the little kid's name was Freddie, and he had never seen or saw anybody who had the same name as him. And he was kind of like taken aback that somebody else would have his name. It was kind of cute, but it was also kind of telling. And then I realized that probably nobody ever really looked at this man's picture in 100 years and thought something like that. Then we're almost done with these gentlemen, and I appreciate your patience. Irving Wall was in the U.S. Army. He served until 1918. He was born in New Jersey. He lived on George Street. He worked for the Scott printing press. He died from pneumonia in 1918 in France, and he's buried in Pleasant Hill, Atlantic County, New Jersey. And his mother was notified of his death. And there's a small obituary that was in the paper saying that he died in France. It's not always easy to find these records. One of the reasons is because in 1973, there was a fire at the National Record Center. So a lot of records got burned. So you have to look different places to find records. And that's one of the reasons why when Martin Kane's inquiry came in, I notified Congresswoman's office, because if anybody can get a record, it would be the Congresswoman. There's other ways of finding records, and they probably know better than how a regular civilian can get a record. Edward Walsh was in the U.S. Navy. He served from August to October 1918. He was born in Newark, and he also died of pneumonia. Not much else is known about him other than the registry card and the index card. And his mother was living in Newark at the time when she was notified of his death. Weber, Clarence Weber, we're not even sure what military branch he was in. He was born in Plainfield in 1894, and he lived on West Fifth Street, and he died 1918. So there's still gaps in information, and it's still, we're still searching for information about people. So if anybody has any other information, it would be most appreciated if you were to contact us. Let me go back. Sorry, technical difficulties with my thumb or my index finger. Let me see. James Whalen was in the U.S. Navy. He served from June to October 1918. He was born in Plainfield, 1896, and he lived on East 2nd Street, and he worked for the Thompson Goodwin Motor Company, and he died from pneumonia October 3rd, 1918, and his parents were the ones that were notified. And he died at the naval base. And sometimes they got notification that they were seriously ill and could make it down to see people. I must have been very harrowing to try to get to different places that were so far away from New Jersey. This is all the information that we have, was that he was buried in St. Mary's Cemetery. And we don't have a picture of him. And Sarah, that is our veterans from World War I. And I really appreciate everybody's time and honoring these forgotten men. As I said, in 1999, 2000, 2001, when we were working on the monument in Plainfield, the pictures of these soldiers did not exist. And it was very fortunate that the state of New Jersey, someone in the state of New Jersey in the 1920s had the foresight to request pictures of family members. And some family members they were able to get in touch with, and others they were not. And you can find a lot of information on the New Jersey State archives, and you can actually access anybody that they have listed there that was in World War I and some other wars. So Sarah, that's it. So I hope I can answer people's questions, and thank you for your time.